Let's get started. Hi, my name is Emmanuel Paraskakis, and today I'll be talking to you about prototyping and sharing with others a REST API. And you know, I was listening to a podcast by Daniel Pink yesterday. He's an author. He wrote this book, Drive, and many other books. And he was saying that kind of the worst time to be doing any cognitive work is between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And here we are at 3 p.m., smack dab in the middle of that. So I appreciate you guys being here, and I think that means you care about APIs. I care about APIs. So does everybody in this room, is everybody in this room familiar with REST and HTTP APIs? Yes? Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about REST APIs here, and we're going to be talking about how you can make a better API for consumption by other users. Awesome. Why would we need a prototype of an API? So an API is a product. It's a software product, just like I think that you will need to show it to others who are going to consume it before you even write a single line of code. Why is that? Because you want the others that are going to use the API to be successful. And you're not going to be successful with that unless you take into account their opinion about what they want, what data they want in that API. So you need feedback from people. And in order to have feedback, you need a way to show them what you mean, what you're going to make in an API. What you need is the equivalent of the UI wireframe for an API. But of course, that thing doesn't exist. So we're going to talk about to that today. And in order to show them what you mean, the best way to do so is to show a mock of an API, what's going to be in place of the API, something that looks a lot like the end product, but isn't the end product. Because you don't want to go into the trouble of creating and coding that API and making that whole end product if you don't know whether it's going to be successful. So you want the mock. And also, it's a great way to reason about an API and discuss about an API with others. A lot of the time, we go up on a whiteboard and we sketch out the JSON payloads. Here's what it should be. No, let me show you what it should be. Or we write a document, like a loose form document that contains a description of the API. I think there's a better way about that to discuss it externally and internally. And finally, after we're done discussing and agreeing on what an API should look like, we need a permanent record, we need a description to act as our agreement and our contracts with others about what that API is going to do. So once we have figured out the design of the API, we need a way for other people to look at that design and say, yes, this is what I'm going to code against from the front-end perspective, and from the back-end perspective, this is what I'm going to code and make sure I deliver what was agreed on as a final product. So best way to do that is use that mock of the API as a stand-in while you implement the back-end, but also while the front-end people are implementing their front-end design. So how are we going to do this? First of all, we're going to have what's called an API description document. It's going to be something that looks like code in a domain-specific language that is used to describe REST APIs. So it's a language dedicated to describing REST APIs. We're also going to use examples of the data payloads in the requests and the responses, so we can show others what we mean. And we're going to use APIary, a free tool that's used as a whiteboard to host that API description and the examples and to share with others. And you'll be able to go on APIary and register and follow what I do and do this for free. And in APIary, we're going to have access to a mock server and a documentation renderer that looks at that API description document and automatically renders our mock and our documentation. Okay? So the domain-specific language that we're going to use today, there are others, but today we're going to use API Blueprint. It's an open source language. You can go find it on GitHub. It's spec and various tools and implementations. And it's based on Markdown. Is everybody here familiar with Markdown? Do you know Markdown? Okay. Markdown is an easy way to write formatted text, because we are going to be writing text, we are going to be writing documentation for our API, so it's a great way to do it. That are supported by APIary, we'll talk about them in the end. They're also very useful. We'll talk about them in the end. All right, so with that, I'm going to finish with the slides and jump right into my browser. I'm going to fight the screen resizing here, and I'm going to go on APIary.io, which you can go all in and register for free. And in fact, I'm going to start as an unregistered user and go register for free and show you how to prototype an API as a new user on APIary. So let me jump in and do that. All right, I'm going to end this slideshow here because it's not going to, oh gosh, okay. Let me fight the display here for a moment. Okay, give me a second here. I tried to prepare for that earlier, but didn't really work for me. All right, here we go. And we're going to scale. All right. It's going to go away, and we're going to go to the browser. OK. So if you browse over to apiary.io, this is what there is a call to action to sign up either with GitHub, your GitHub credentials, if you already have them. That's going to work. Or to sign up with your email. And both of them are free. So I'm just going to go and sign up with a new email account. And I'm going to say, okay, and I'm just going to use a random password. Probably won't use the account again. All right, so I'm going to sign up for APIary. Not going to use one password. So next thing I'm seeing is I'm successfully logged in and registered, and it's asking me, OK, name that first API that you want to prototype. So I'm just going to go with that default here. And I'm going to continue and leave that selection to API Blueprint for now. And I'm just going to go save and start using APIary. So the next thing I would see is something that looks a lot like a code editor. On the left, I have text and an editor that I can type in. And on the right, I have a preview of my API documentation. I'm going to turn off that preview momentarily and just guide you through this document. So if you know Markdown, you'll see that this is pure Markdown. You could take this document and put it in, let's say, GitHub, and it would render as nicely formatted Markdown. So there's nothing really special about the Markdown here, but the editor also understands some API, REST API specific things within that text. And it interprets the headings as follows. So the first heading is going to be the title of my API. So I'm just going to say Oracle Code Boston API. And if I turn my my preview back on, I can see that I'm seeing the live preview as I type. Next follows some simple text that is about providing a description to users. I may choose to enter here, why I created this API, some simple instructions to get started and so on. And the next heading is about that first resource that I'm going to call in my API. The resource is going to be of the base URL. And there is a base URL here in the template, but I'm going to go ahead and delete it to show you that I don't need an implementation behind it. It's just going to be this design that renders to a mock server into documentation. So the first resource I have, I'm giving it a name. I'm calling it the questions collection, and the resource is /questions. This particular template is about an API that is used for polling people, asking questions to people, and then people can vote on choices on the question. For example, was this talk good or bad? Which API description language you use? Things like that. So my first resource is that questions collection /questions, and then the next heading, heading 3, denoted by the 3 signs here, is going to be the get method on that questions resource. And I'm going to name that action. I'm going to say it's the action to list all questions. So if you wanted to list all the questions in my API that somebody already created, you would do a get on the /questions resource. And then below this, there follows an example. Remember, we were talking about examples of what the payload should look like. So it's saying there is a response that should come back from the get method if it's successful. And it's going to have a 200 status code in HTTP parlance. This means everything was OK. And the payload that's going to come back in the response, it's going to be in JSON. It says there what the expected payload should be. And we also have an example of the payload. And all it is an array denoted by these square brackets with one element of this question object. The question has a title, it has a date, and it has the 4 choices, and it also has the votes that we're going to say that were tallied there. So what I can do just with this template that came in without me typing anything is I can go over to my documentation, and you will see that the documentation is interactive. I can do things with it. This is what your end user would see. Click on list all questions, and I can try that list all questions resource and get method. So if I hit try and call the resource, I'm going to get back pretty much the example that I gave it. So simple enough up until now. What's interesting about this approach is that the tooling, APIary, generates a URL for you. This is the mock URL. I'm going to highlight it here. And if I just go over in a new tab, and it's a get method, so I can do this on my browser and just hit it, you'll see that that JSON comes back. So the tooling has automatically stood up a mock server for me and returns those examples. And if I were to go back to my editor and say, you know what, the front-end developers looked at this and they kind of didn't like it the way it was, and they said, let's just add a count of the number of choices here. This is what we want for our application. Don't know why they want it, but this is what they want. And if I save here, as you would expect, if I run that request again, that count is going to be in there. So now I can have suggestions that come in and make edits to my source document and have those edits be present in the mock service that somebody else is already starting to consume and writing a front-end application with. So you can see how that's powerful. So this particular API has that get or list all my questions in the question collection, and it also has a post to create a new question. Well, what if I wanted to add another resource? So I'm just going to copy this stuff real quick. I'm going to show you how you can expand this API to make it a fully CRUD API, create, read, update, and delete really quickly. So I'm just going to go here at the end of the document, paste this in, and say, you know what, I need a new resource. It's going to be the get a single question. I'm going to pass it an ID as a parameter to say, okay, which question by its ID am I interested in? And I'm not going to say, let's see, it's the single question resource. And just turn the preview on here so you guys can see. So save this, and I'm going to say, just retrieve a question. Now, if you're following along, you'll see there's a semantic issue. So the editor understands that, hey, you know, it's giving me guidance that I didn't do something right. And what that's going to be, it's saying, you know what, you entered a resource, you entered a method, but there's no response. So you're missing that, so go fix that. Okay, so what do I do here? So one thing I can do is I can just take this example and modify it a little bit. Maybe I want to use the same thing here. So just paste it at the end. And because this is getting a single question, I don't want that array. I want just the single element of that array. So make it a single element, and you know what? I'm just going to fix the indenting here. Just here. Now, one thing I didn't talk about is what this ID does. So I'm going to have to go and describe that. And to do that, I can describe my parameters. And I can say, you know, my parameter is going to be an ID. I'm going to give it an example because we always need examples to show people what it's like. It's a different thing to say ID. Maybe it's a UUID, maybe it's an integer, I don't know. So in this example, I'm just going to say ID is 3. And I'm going to say it's required. So the tooling knows that if I give me an error, and I'm going to say it's a number, and I can enter a description for it and say the unique ID or something of that sort. So now I have everything to describe my single resource and how I go get that single resource. And if I've done everything right, and you know, if I've saved, I think I can go back here and I can go questions/3, and it gives me that single payload. Again, it's an example which I pasted in. There's better ways to do it. I'll show you that at the end. Interesting thing is the tooling, being a mock service, doesn't really care about what parameters you give it, as long as it's of the right type. Remember, we said it's required and is a number. So even if I give it a 4, it'll give me back that same example. So I can have my front-end app just going through and getting different questions. It'll get something back that is of the type that is expected. So similarly, if I wanted to do how do I change this resource? Well, the way to do it is to just say it's going to be a put. So change a question, and it's going to be a put on that same resource. Remember, I already have that resource. Well, a put is going to need both the request and the response, and I did have the shape of a request ready to go here in my post, so I can go and just reuse that. I may want to evolve this as I go along, but for now it'll do. So I have one request, and I'm just going to return the same response that the singleton gets give me. So request response, put it here, remember to save. It's a valid document, and if I go over to my documentation, I should be able to see not only the 2 actions on the questions collection, but also the 2 actions on the single question. I can click on that, see examples, see what the data is like, what it should look like, and even try it out and test that out. So if I wanted to complete, remember we said CRUD API, we need the delete in there. Really, really simple to come back and say, you know what, I need just another action, and it's going to be the remove, if I could even type, remove a question. And that's going to be the delete. method, it recognizes that, and well, for the delete, the convention is that you don't really need a payload coming back. You don't need a request, you don't need a payload. All you need is to say delete this resource number 3, it's gone. So I'm gonna do response is 204. And 204 means no payload. I'm pretty much done. So this gives me, in the space of, I don't know, it was about 10 minutes or so, a skeleton for a fully functional API with all kinds of actions. I can go many ways from here. I can say, I'm going to add more resources. I can say, I'm going to add more cases for what happens. So, for example, what if I messed up the ID and my API didn't find that resource? I'm going to want to model that. So let me go back to my single question and say, I had response 200, but I'm just going to add that response 404. Now, 404 means not found. And I can say, in this case, for whatever reason, my front-end developers want a plain text error message. Okay. I can enter that, and I can say, something like not found. Not very good, but it'll do for a first pass. And once I go into my documentation, I can go into the single question, and I can see that there's multiple responses. But what's really cool is that I can also try it out. Remember, I can send in an ID, call the resource, it'll give me back that first choice. But what if I wanted to simulate somehow in my front-end code, I want to branch off and I want this error to show up so I can see how I can handle it. Well, it turns out there's a way you can do this in the tooling. You can pass this prefer header, and you can say, I prefer 404. So when you send that back, it'll just give you what you expect. Now, the idea is that as a back-end and front-end developer, you should be looking as people use the API, as people try things, and there's a tool for that, is an inspector that shows you all of the requests that came in, whether they're successful or not successful. So you can go in here and look at each request and kind of debug what's going on, either as a front-end developer consuming the API or as a back-end developer writing the API. Other thing you can do is you can run some tests. So we have a free open source tool called Dredd. It's a command line tool. What it does is it looks at a given API description, looks at your implementation, and gives you a pass-fail, so exits with 0 or 1. And that's very useful either when you're doing TDD on the desktop, like did I match the specification of this API that we all agreed? Or even when you're done and it's in production and you're refactoring, you can put this into your CI/CD, and it will prevent you from deploying something that breaks that spec. So you can see how that's really, really powerful. Now, I also talked about sharing the spec with others. You can hit that little person menu there and invite others via email. In the free version of this product, you can invite up to 5 people to edit and up to 10 people to view. So that's really, really useful if you want to get others to give you feedback, if you want to get the front-end developers that are going to consume the API to contribute and start giving you, remember we said, make this simple change, put the count in there, that's really going to help us. That's easy to do once you invite somebody to collaborate with you. Again, you can do this today. Last but not least, here in the settings, you can go link that particular document with a repo in GitHub. Why is that important? A, because you can track changes. B, because you can push in changes through GitHub, so you can have people contributing to GitHub. And C, because when it comes time to do testing, that we showed with that command line tool with Dredd, you can pull the latest spec from GitHub into your own CI/CD. So, and we think it's a best practice to put the API description in the same repo as the code that implements it. And there's advanced versions of this product that allow you to do branching and so on, but for a small project, you can just do this for free in your free GitHub repo. So really, really useful. All right. Well, of course, you can also get help. There's questions on Stack Overflow. There's documentation, and you can even contact the team for support. So documentation will give you, ways to get started and so on. And obviously, Stack Overflow, you can go ask questions and get them answered there, hopefully. All right. So that's kind of it for the basic stuff. The other thing that I wanted to show you is you can imagine that pasting all of this text and all of these JSON payloads kind of gets old after a while, and it's not dry, and you could make a mistake. So there are better ways to do this. And again, you can try these as you go along. So I'm logged into another account here on my other browser, and I have some examples to show you. So one thing I can show you is, first of all, you can use JSON Schema. JSON Schema is a way to describe a JSON schema and a way to apply some constraints into your payload. So if you're using JSON Schema to doing some testing, you can use that there in the API description. Perhaps your API consumer can grab that JSON schema and go reuse it in their tooling. So all this is saying, for example, is, what's the schema for the question look like? Well, the question should be there, the choices should be there, and there should be a minimum of 2 items in that array. So that's useful information. Second thing I wanted to show you is, here's a more evolved API than the one we saw. So this is an API about ordering groceries, and it has some crazy features, like I want to create a recipe and make a recipe out of my items that I ordered, and orders and recall. So we were doing this for a demo. And that API, all these resources and actions that it has, it gets quite long, and it can get much, much longer than this in real life. So this one is 350 lines long, like 10,000 lines long. So you can see how that gets really, really difficult to maintain with all of these JSON blobs that you're pasting in and out. So one thing you can do in API Blueprint is you can use the so-called Sampson notation. What that does is, in this particular API that uses Sampson, you won't see a JSON blob anywhere. What you will see is a simple way to describe data structures. For example, this is a project API, and we're saying, what is a project? Well, it's an array of tasks. What is a task? It has all of these fields here, and it also includes a team member. Well, what is a team member? It has all these things, but it's also composed, from a user. So you can see how you can kind of compose your data structures, and that makes it much, much easier to maintain and not make a mistake, and then use them. This is the same syntax that we were seeing before, only without the JSON blobs. Use them in your responses and requests. So, for example, the get a project collection, all it needs is to say, I'm an array of project, I'm done. So when you go and change project, it's going to change all over your API. And of course, with this very complex API, you only got 70 lines. So that's one way to optimize things and make things better as you move forward. Now, last but not least, we also support the other very well-known spec called Swagger, or OpenAPI. And this is not a Markdown API, it's mainly a YAML API description language. So it's a little bit more involved to write. So in this example, I have a very simple API, much like the first iteration of the questions API. It's just got 2 resources, as you can see. But if you go and look at the source, it's got quite a bit of stuff in it. But it's a very, very good format. You want other tooling and interoperates with stuff. So Swagger is very, very pervasive. So both languages are supported, and we think you need to choose which one according to the way you're going to use things. All right, so that's about it what I had. I'm going to attempt to show you that last slide here, maybe. And describe how all this there. So APIary, which is the tooling that you just saw, came in through an acquisition into Oracle about a year ago. So Oracle has already been developing its own API management suite, so tools for your runtime, gateways and monitoring and so on. And we started to work together as a startup with Oracle and integrating with this tool set. And at some point, it was a good idea to get the company into Oracle. So now we have a full tool set that takes care of that whole API lifecycle from design, implementation, testing, publishing, documentation, and running the runtime. And we're really serious about APIs and open source. We're part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We're part of the Open API Initiative. And of course, we have the Open API Blueprint spec in open source. And APIary that you just saw here, and you can go register for free, has pretty much 325,000 users that have created an API, created that API design that you saw. And there's 425,000 of these. So it's pretty big. We've been around for about 4 or 5 years, and it's pretty much the biggest API design repository in the world. And there's about 3 million people that have come and looked at documentation. So a lot of companies have their API documentation in there and manage their API lifecycle on APIary. So hope you can try it. You'll always be able to use it for free. Bunch of open source tooling that's available on apiblueprint.org and on apiary.io, so go check that out. And with that, I think I'm all set, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Sir.
Can you, this is on your site, right, on the website. Can you, if you want to use it for internal on-prem version, can you install your service?
Internal, yes. On-prem, no. This is a cloud-based service, so it's accessible through the web. Internally, yes, you can close everything off and have only internal API so that only registered users can go and look at the source or even the documentation. All right.
It's pretty much just a documentation, or how you further integrate with the implementation?
So it's the source of truth for what the API description or API design should be. And from that source of truth, you can drive documentation, you can drive tests, you can drive the implementation with generators, mostly on the Swagger or API sides. There's a lot of generators, both on the client and on the server. And you can also drive configuration of your runtime and monitoring. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because you don't want to sit there and configure everything from scratch and document everything from scratch. And then when you change something in the API, go back and do it all from scratch. Having that API description that describes the service unambiguously is a very, very useful thing to have as a reference, both for testing and for configuration.
So I saw that you generated endpoint URIs, which can, assuming that can be directly used when we are building front-end applications.
Yep.
Is there a dependency on cores for that?
There's no dependency. They're just hosted on the web for you, on the cloud for you. And it's just another URL. Of course, they're not production URLs. You're going to be rate limited. It's just for understanding how the API works and for developing against the API. So think of it as a sandbox.
It's definitely helpful because then you don't have to have an end product while you're building
Right.
application. You can use this and
Yeah.
take a sample data and keep building your front end and integrate together after.
Absolutely, and it implements that contract, that agreement in the API description that you're bringing others to contribute to, and you should all agree on what that API should look like. Of course, there is some point where you move over to the implementation, so you can't ask this thing to do, data manipulation for you. You can't really say, oh, if I send this payload in, then return me that other payload, or add two things and give it back to me. At that point, you're probably going into implementation. But it's a very, very quick way to get started and show other people what you need done. Yeah. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very, very. Oh, you have a question?
I hope you can hear me. So I was wondering how the traffic flow analysis feature worked. Is there like a proxy, or what was that you were showing?
There is a proxy.
Okay.
Yep. There is a proxy. So if you want to use that traffic analysis, the request responses go through the proxy on the cloud. And we do also have some magic that allows you to use internal APIs with that proxy. All right. All right, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.